morning, everyone. Welcome back. As I mentioned this week here in Chennai, a different setting. So this is now our fourth week of this class, establishing a daily practice. So why don't we begin with, as usual, just a few minutes of quiet sitting together, if you can do the breath meditation that we practiced. And then we can do a few opening prayers. Okay. So let's do the opening prayers. I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. The merits of teaching the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. For my merits of teaching the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. My merits of teaching the Dharma, become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. May all sentient beings have happiness in its causes. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and its causes. May all sentient beings never be separated from sorrowless bliss. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free of attachment and aversion. Okay, we'll begin with that. So just a brief refresher. We've had now 3 sessions so far. So in the first session, we talked about a general introduction practice and also started talking about the 6 preparatory practices, which we've now completed. So this involved first finding a suitable place for meditation, cleaning the space, arranging a proper seat, and then arranging an altar, so forth, and then sitting in the proper posture, taking refuge, and other preparatory, as we just did now in the session. And then also the visualization of the merit field, which we did in the second week. And we discussed also then, of course, about the altar setup and about how to temple etiquette and so forth. And then last week we continued on with the mandala offering, which we discussed, which is helpful to do as part of the offering practice, and the 7-limb prayer, which I believe we talked about actually in the second week. And then finally, we talked about supplication last week. So as I said, these are all preparatory practices that we can use for any session, anytime we do meditation. We can put more or less time into them, depending on how much time we have. You shouldn't feel like you have to rush because you have to get all the preparatory practices done. You have to be reasonable with how much time you have. Of course, it's good to try to make more time if you can. But you can do those in an extensive or an abbreviated way, whatever way is easier for you. And if you like that Shakyamuni Buddha practice that we did last week, then you can also use that, or you can use any kind of other guru yoga practice or meditation practice that is standard. And of course, you can modify a few things here and there if it's not suitable to you, and some things you might not find meaningful to you at the beginning, and so you gradually can incorporate them as you find them meaningful. You don't have to force it. Like I said with the mandala offering, start slowly if it seems very complicated, and gradually practice it and see if you find it helpful for you. So within that, then, of course, there's the actual meditation session, as we call it, which means focusing on a particular topic or a particular visualization. It could be mantra recitation also. And we talked about last week, if you do the Shakyamuni Buddha practice, you can do the mantra recitation as part of that, the mantra of Shakyamuni Buddha. But then within that space, once you've cultivated a good frame of mind where you're present and your mind feels, we say, supple, able to engage in a topic, then you can meditate on a particular topic. And you might start with some concentration meditation for a little while if you have time. And then you focus on analysis of a particular topic. So that's what we're going to talk about this week and next week. So actually using the mind to analyze a particular topic for contemplation. So I'll begin the slides here. Okay, good. Okay, so let's see. Okay. So here we have establishing daily practice, session 4. Okay. So we have here popular ideas about meditation. So I thought it was very helpful to think about this, because if we read the Lamrim, for example, which we're going to talk about today, there's a whole section in the Lamrim about popular ideas about meditation. But this was in 14th century Tibet. So there are different popular ideas about meditation today, although it's interesting to see how much overlap there is. And I'm going to also talk a little bit about some of the popular ideas about meditation that other Buddhist masters encountered in different parts of Buddhist history, and we'll see that a lot of them might be quite similar. Seems like these ideas keep coming up again and again. But it's very useful to think about this because our idea of what meditation is going to be very much informed by popular ideas we hear. We might not even realize it. Just the word meditation, we can think about what do we think about with that word and what does it mean in the English language? Because it's a subtle thing that we can easily maybe misinterpret, or just there are different ways to understand it. So it's hard to say one is exactly wrong, but they might be different pieces of the puzzle. So let's look here. I just pulled these off the internet because I thought it was the best way to find popular ideas. If we just somebody searches for what is meditation, what are they going to find? So we have here, the first is, the goal of meditation is to feel. It's a chance for your mind to communicate with your body. Thinking while meditating can subtract from this body to self-conversation. Right? So what we do in our monastery is debate. So we like to take apart statements, and it's useful to do so because any kind of statement is trying to convey something, and the person might have a genuine sense of what they're trying to say. But when we say the goal of meditation is to feel, right there, it's a big question. What does that mean? Right? We're feeling all of the time, so that doesn't exactly change anything. So it seems like more likely the person is saying to be in touch with what we're feeling, to access what we're experiencing. But again, this seems to be taken for granted that there's a kind of natural, if we just tune in with our natural state of things, that will be a kind of awakening experience or an enlightenment. That was something that we'll see that Tsongkhapa was quite opposed to. That was a common view also at the time in Tibet, that meditation is about just accessing the natural state of our minds and not building anything. We don't have to make any kind of conscious effort. It's quite the opposite. So this person here is saying thinking while meditating, but the general idea seems to be putting any kind of effort into what we're doing. We just need to allow things to occur naturally. Thinking while meditating can subtract from this conversation. So it's implying that any kind of thought is an obstruction to meditation. That's also a very common idea. Now we'll see that there's a subtle distinction here. Again, there is some truth to what they're saying. We don't want to be distracted, and our normal everyday thoughts are quite coarse and disruptive, and they can be an obstacle. That's why we're doing these preparatory practices, for example, to bring our minds into a better space where our ordinary thoughts don't intrude. But then to go to the extreme to say that any kind of thought is an obstacle is difficult, right? Because, for example, if we're talking about calm abiding meditation, one of the most common ways to do that is to visualize the statue of the Buddha or a picture of the Buddha in front of oneself. That is a thought. At least in Buddhist philosophy, that is considered a thought. A thought doesn't have to be linguistic. A thought doesn't have to be sudden and discursive. It's a sustained thought. And likewise, of course, with analytical meditation, even more so, as we'll talk about today, there are thoughts going on. But it's happening in a different space than we usually think about things, and especially it's directed in a particular way. But right now, for example, we are talking, right? I'm giving you ideas through my speech. When I speak, the speech then inspires particular thoughts to come into the mind that mirror that speech. That's something that's talked a lot about in Buddhist philosophy as well. The thoughts and speech are very similar in the way that they engage objects. So that is it ought to be supportive to your meditation. I hope so. If not, then there's not much use in teaching anybody. So again, we might say, well, thinking while meditating can subtract from it, but we need to think outside of the meditation. So that's even right there. We recognize that there is some degree of a way that thought can be a support. Now there's a question, we bring that into the meditation as well? So then we have this second idea here. So this says this practice of maintaining awareness And looking deeply is something different from ordinary thinking. So that's somewhat similar to what I was just saying, that there is a thought process, but not quite the same. So then it says it is not linear, analytical, or goal-oriented, right? Now here's some question here, right? Because if we say that it is not analytical, that's quite the opposite of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to analyze things, right? And it's not goal-oriented. Well, that's a subtle question, right? Because it is goal-oriented in one regard. What we're trying to do through meditation is enhance positive mental states and diminish negative ones. That is the primary goal. We're not just meditating for no reason. But at the same time, if we get too focused on having a particular predetermined outcome of what happens, that can be an obstacle. So I often use the example of exercise to describe meditation because it's something that most people understand nowadays. And it has a lot of similarities. It's not exactly the same. So we think about exercise. Most exercise is goal-oriented. People are exercising to be in shape or to excel at a sport, something like that. But at the same time, it's recognized that when you're exercising, if you're too concerned about what you want to become and not being present in the moment, we say sometimes in the zone, then that can be an obstacle. It's a similar thing in meditation. Overarchingly, we have a goal of what we're trying to do, but you have to work with where you are and what's in your mind and not have a fantasy that I am something more than what I am right now. But again, like with exercise, sometimes you need to push yourself a bit. If you just accept, well, I can't do it, it's too hard, I'm not just my natural limitation, then you might shortchange yourself from what you actually could achieve with a good coach. Likewise, in meditation, if we just accept, well, this is just how I am, I can't really change that, then we might not recognize that there is really a potential to change, and we don't have a coach, but we have a teacher. Sometimes we call a guru. If we have a really serious teacher that is able to inspire us in that way, that has some kind of similar function to a coach. I sometimes think personally that my first experience of having a guru, which prepared me a bit for my Buddhist experience, was my wrestling coach in high school, who I was actually quite devoted to in a worldly sense, but I was willing to follow his instruction, even though it was very challenging for me oftentimes, because he was inspiring and he seemed to really care about me and was willing to work with me where I was. So that's the qualities of a good coach. And that's the qualities of a good teacher as well here. So then it says, sometimes a deeper knowing or understanding spontaneously occurs. Now that's a good point, right? I think that, so again, I don't quite agree with the saying it's not analytical, but I do agree with this point that sometimes something can spontaneously occur that's beyond the analysis. I think of it as in terms of our minds, we have both subtle and grosser aspects of the mind, coarser aspects, what we might call in Western psychology, they talk about conscious mind, unconscious mind, or there's some circles of psychology, they call it subliminal mind, which I prefer, because subconscious or unconscious especially implies that there's nothing going on. It's not conscious, whereas in Buddhist philosophy, there is a conscious process. It's just not at the level of awareness that we're waking or aware of it. Like when we're dreaming, there's a conscious process going on there. So this subliminal level of mind is not something we can control directly. We can only have direct control over the coarser aspects of mind. But by controlling those in a particular way, we can have some effect on what happens in the course the sort of more the subliminal levels of mind take. Some of you might know the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He was actually quite also a bit philosophical in his approach. He wrote some about this idea of how to work with the subtler levels of mind, although they didn't have quite that language now that we have. This was before the advent of dynamic psychology in the West. And he talked about how he wrote poems. He implied that he didn't write the poem, he would put his mind in a space where the poem would just come to him spontaneously. He would focus on what he wanted to write and think about ideas, and then he would go for a walk around the pond, and it would just come to him full form, and then he would write down what came to his mind. I think that's actually not bad advice for how to meditate. We put our minds in a particular space, and we do a lot of practice. We might recite mantras, we might do prostrations, all of these practices, and we actually do analyze as well, because that is driving our minds in a particular way. But there's some subtler process going on that's outside of conscious awareness. And so, although we can't directly control that, we can create the conditions for it to work in a particular way. Even some scientists talk about this. I think there's something here about the way the mind works. Somebody like Einstein, you might know, talks about how when some of his greatest ideas came to him, like about general relativity, it just seemed to spontaneously come to him from something outside of himself. But of course, he had trained his mind very carefully in science and was deeply thinking about these questions. But when the answer finally came, it came from beyond his ordinary way of thinking, which was necessary to have a completely radical shift in scientific thinking. So there's been quite a bit written about this, and I've read about it more in Western accounts, because in Buddhist philosophy they don't talk about it exactly the same way, but it seems that they had an understanding of it. As we look at the stories of the great teachers, and we'll talk a bit about Tsongkhapa today as well, and see that this manifested in his life. So we don't want to go to either extreme. We don't want to just reject analysis because it's an obstacle. That's just because we all ultimately want to go beyond analysis doesn't mean it's not a step in the way. And that was Tsongkhapa's point very clearly. But at the same time, we have to recognize that we have to be open to something else happening. And this is a skill that we cultivate in meditation. It takes a lot of practice. It's not something that is easy to communicate and that we can learn over the weekend. But if we try this for many, many years, and also use other methods that I'll talk about some of that more later, about ways we can structure our life to enhance this process, then gradually this can become more real for us. So then finally, we have mindfulness. It's a pretty straightforward word. It suggests that the mind is fully attending to what's happening, to what you're doing, to the space you're moving through. So this term mindfulness is central in Buddhist practice, and it's become even more central actually in modern day meditation. We talk about mindfulness meditation. So it's useful to think about where this idea came from, because what's understood as mindfulness in modern times is not quite what they were talking about in the ancient texts. It doesn't mean that's necessarily wrong today either, but it's good to understand what they meant and how it relates to how people conceive of it today. There's an excellent book on this subject, which is called Right Mindfulness by Thanissaro Bhikkhu. I don't believe that you can check. I don't believe you could order it from Amazon. It's published by their monastery in California. But if you search for their monastery, search for Thanissaro Bhikkhu, which is Thanissaro, Thanissaro Bhikkhu. He's British man, but he's ordained in the Thai tradition. And then it should take you to his monastery. I'm forgetting the name now, but if people are unable to find it, I will look in that book and I will send they have their address, I believe. I don't remember them having a website in the book, but I know they have a website because we have downloaded a couple things from there. So anyway, in that book, he talks a lot about popular conceptions of mindfulness today and how these came about. Personally, I always like a historical perspective on things. I think it gives us a lot of insight into our current ideas. So he talks about how the word mindfulness, the translation of the term. So the term in Sanskrit is smriti, which means a kind of remembering. And it's I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, but in Tibetan, I can tell you, Trenpa, which is a Tibetan translation of Smriti, it means remembering. It's the colloquial word. If I say I remember something, I say not trenso, tren. So the point here, the reason it was translated by this British scholar named T.W. Restated in about 1900, he's actually quite astute. He didn't use the word remembrance or remembering. He used the word mindfulness. He was a Christian, as most people were in Britain at that time. And in Christianity, mindfulness meant a sense of keeping something in active memory. So really, it would be like be mindful of the needs of others. Don't just think about yourself. Always keep that in mind. So mindfulness is not just about having a great memory that when asked, you can recall lots of facts. It's about keeping something in active memory. So when we learn particular teachings, we learn particular skills and tools that we're trying to cultivate in meditation, they're only useful if we can keep them in mind. If we're trying to keep the mind focused on a particular object, but we get distracted, that's a lack of mindfulness because we forget that we're trying to think about something. We're trying to keep a particular framework of thinking. And we try to keep that throughout the day. So as Buddhist practitioners, we try to think about the faults of negative emotions, of following attachment, of following anger. We have to keep that in mind all the time. Otherwise, we easily lose ourselves to those emotions. So that if we understand mindfulness that way, it's an excellent mirror of how it's understood in the tradition. Today, it's often understood as a kind of present awareness in the present moment, which is a useful skill to cultivate, absolutely. And so a lot of people have found benefit in that. But it's important to understand that if we're reading a Buddhist text, to understand there is a little difference in what they're talking about. And also the extreme that can come from that is then to think that any kind of recollection of a past event or any kind of thought of the future is an obstacle to meditation, which is sometimes how it's presented. I think that's a bit of a mistake, and Thanissaro Bhikkhu, he also points that out. Because in meditation, sometimes it can be very useful to think about the past, to think about how we behaved in the past, to what was going on in our minds, to observe our minds in a particular situation where we have some distance from it. And we can see what was going on, what was my mind creating, and how was I reacting? And likewise, thinking about the future, thinking, how am I going to act in the future in a way that is more in line with my values now? And what kind of goals am I pursuing? So as I said before, it's not necessarily not goal-oriented. We talk about bodhicitta, the wish to achieve enlightenment. That's the biggest goal we can possibly aspire for. So we do want to cultivate that, but we also want to have it happen in a way that it doesn't carry us away. And I think that's what people are meaning when they talk about it in the way of being in the present moment without necessarily using that word. We don't want to just be lost in thoughts about the past and obsessing about what happened yesterday and then getting carried away by emotion to the point where we lose mindfulness. We're no longer aware that we're trying to cultivate a particular mindset while we're meditating. We're just thinking about tomorrow and meeting my friend and all of the things I'm going to do. And then your meditation session is not that much different from planning your day. But if it can be done at a subtler level, again, it's learning to recognize in meditation, this is also a very difficult skill to cultivate, when the mind is truly distracted versus when it's the case that actually we're processing something that is useful for our own cultivation. And it's not easy to make that distinction. It has to come through experience and through sometimes seeing that I thought I was distracted, but then actually it turns out my mind was bringing me somewhere that I needed to go through this again. I needed to work with this again because it was not a result in my mind. So I'll leave it at that. I can't spend the whole session talking about that, but I think it's important to consider that from our own experience. Okay, I hope you can all see this again, right? Just put your thumb up if you can see it. No.
I'll
Okay.
pull it back up.
Yeah, why don't you bring it up then? Okay, so as I said, I just want to look at how this is played out throughout Buddhist history. This isn't a new question. It's not like people today necessarily have different ideas than occurred at different times. So we see this, first of all, in terms of the Buddha's own lifetime. Right? So some of you may have read the biography of the Buddha, that Buddha found his first two teachers. Before he became Buddha, when he was searching for enlightenment, he had these two teachers who led him to advanced states of meditation, but he felt it wasn't the ultimate truth. It wasn't the final cessation of suffering. He was able to go into deep states of meditation that they had taught him, and they were impressed and asked him, in both cases, asked him to be their co-teachers. But he felt that this was limited. Merely concentrating the mind, this is the main point. Merely putting the mind in a deep state of concentration where there's no conscious activity, the Buddha considered that not enlightenment. That is a temporary state. It doesn't really work through anything. So like I just talked about, sometimes it's useful to allow things into our mind. Otherwise, it's in some sense not that different from going to sleep. If you're in very deep sleep, your mind, nothing's happening. Not just a dream state, but very deep sleep. But when you come out of the sleep, are you any more spiritually aware than you were before? So we see that he learned the state of nothingness and then more advanced techniques, but the Buddha perceived that these could not provide a complete solution to suffering. It's actually said in the traditional Buddhist accounts that if somebody cultivates this state at a very deep level, in a future lifetime, they will be born in a place where they just are in this state of meditation for a long time. But it will eventually end, as everything does, and they'll be born back into an ordinary experience like we have. And actually, their mind will be more dull as a result, because they will have cultivated just a sense of pushing away thoughts. Their mind won't work with as much agility as ordinary people have. It's also something we might recognize. It's good to look at this. Certainly don't judge anybody and don't point it out to them unless they really are interested. But we might see some people who cultivate meditation and they're quite calm, but there isn't a lot of wisdom behind that. And it's actually can also often become an obstacle to maintaining presence with what people are talking about and to fully engaging in anything in life, because the mind is in this state, and anything else is seen as a disturbance. They don't want to be taken out of that state. So in Buddhist practice, that is not considered enlightenment. That actually is considered a pitfall that we can fall into. So let's go to the next slide. This is an example that I've come across. I'm mostly, of course, familiar with the Tibetan tradition, but I thought this was interesting because I noticed this pattern in another tradition as well. So this is Haikun, which was a Zen master in, I believe, the 17th century, who spent many years pursuing enlightenment and looking at the different practices that were available to him in the time in Japan. So he critiqued quietist meditation for failing to integrate spiritual insights into everyday life. He felt that there was a movement going on at that time where many people were doing these kinds of meditations where they talked about going into this relaxed state. And he said, that's not enlightenment. And he said, look at the biographies of the great Zen masters and how they had, what do they call, Kensho and Satori experience. These are what are called enlightenment experiences in the Zen tradition. And he said, look, he says that he had 34 Kensho experiences and 17 Satori experiences in his life. So there was a definite experience going on there. It wasn't just a general sense of my life became more and more calm. He says, that's not what is going on now. People say, well, this experience of going into calm, that is enlightenment. And I think it seems pretty much like the thing. He said, if you have it, you know it. It's a real experience. It's very different from, it's a major break from what we usually experience. So he ended up going quite on his own path and pursuing this. And he emphasized bringing all experiences, good and bad, into practice. What does it say here? A meditation in the midst of activity, right? So even while the mind is engaged in ordinary activity, that there's still some meditative awareness going on, and compassion and engagement with others rather than passive withdrawal. But at the end, we see here also he emphasized not pursuing intellectual understanding, which is different. In Tsongkhapa's tradition that we'll talk about in a minute, there's an understanding that even in our intellectual pursuits, when we study, when we debate, we have that same meditative awareness, so it shouldn't be seen as antithetical. Now, I don't know enough about Haikun's tradition to be able to comment more than that, just what I've read in his biography. If you're interested, there's a biography of him called Wild Ivy. But it's quite inspiring to see his real commitment to what he was doing. He worked very hard and seemed to go through quite some serious health obstacles, as a lot of meditators do, and had a very clear experience of enlightenment. It wasn't as though it was, now it feels like I'm more advanced. It was a very clear break at one point in his life. So let's go on to the next slide here. So here we have Tsongkhapa Losang Drakpa, the founder of our school of Buddhism in Tibet. So within Tsongkhapa's lifetime, he strongly criticized a lot of what was going on in Tibet. Although Tsongkhapa was very polite. If we read his text, he never once mentions anybody by name, at least anybody that's contemporary with him. He mentions a few historical figures. It actually makes it a little bit difficult for scholars to try to figure out who he was talking about, because we like to know that now. But he especially criticized the Chinese abbot Hashang. Hashang actually just means monk in Chinese Buddhism, but there was a famous monk from China who had traveled to Tibet in the 8th century. They called him Hashang. His actual name was Hashang Mohayan. And Hashang, as his system is presented, at least in the Tibetan historical records, is he believed that all conceptual thought involved the apprehension of signs of true existence, meaning that it was an obstacle. What we're trying to overcome in meditation is the grasping at true existence, and thereby prevented enlightenment. So Tsongkhapa argued that this was the worst possible misconception because it disregarded all discerning meditation and proper understanding of emptiness. So Tsongkhapa talked about this again and again, that we have to distinguish between conception of true existence, which is what we're trying to overcome, and simply thinking. And he made a lot of references to Indian texts. You'll see that, for example, in Shantideva's text, the Bodhisattva Charyavatara, which all Tibetan schools consider authoritative. He says, we're not trying to overcome sight and sound and hearing and thinking. That's not the dokcha is the word in Tibetan. It's not the thing that we're trying to turn away from. What we're trying to turn away from is the conception of true existence, which is the cause of suffering. So Tsongkhapa, within his lifetime, pursued this ardently. He became the greatest scholar in Tibet. I may have mentioned this in the past talks, to the point where everyone in Tibet was looking to him for guidance, but he still felt he hadn't really found the final answer, even though he had an extraordinary understanding of the Indian philosophical text. I can vouch for that, having studied his texts. We read one major text of his that was composed before he had an enlightened experience, which was called the Golden Garland. He composed this from age 27 to 31, completed it when he was 31. It's a 1,200-page text that reviews a lot of the understandings of the path to enlightenment through various Indian scholars. And just reading the text, when I read that text, it gave me faith in Tsongkhapa. Personally, honestly, before I had read that, I did not really appreciate, other than just people we have his statue in our temples, and we recite his mantra, the Miksema mantra. But to really appreciate what he was saying, to read that text, it just seems like whoever wrote this must have been an extraordinary genius. I could not even contemplate writing something like that. And other people in Tibet had that experience. For example, Daksang Lotsawa was a major critic of Tsongkhapa. He lived a couple generations later, but it said when he read this text, Golden Garland, it changed his mind. And he composed a praise of him and said, I bow before you. Your intellect is the towering intellect. But he still felt he didn't really understand the final meaning. And it's when we read that text, we're aware that it does not present his final view. It actually seems a little bit apprehensive about what is the nature of reality, what is emptiness. It's just a broad review of a lot of different previous texts and pointing out internal contradiction within them, or pointing out where they contradict each other. And he's very astute about that. So later, not knowing where to turn, and this is where I talked a little bit about this kind of going beyond the conceptual aspect, he actually consulted a medium. I would say it today. That's not how they talk about it in the text. They didn't have that word per se, but it was a common thing to do in Tibet. He consulted a monk who claimed to have a direct perception or direct experience of Manjushri, although this monk himself was skeptical of it, which was common of the approach within Tibetan Buddhism, not just to take something just because it appears to you. He said, I'm not sure if this is really Manjushri, but I've had this experience since I was a young person. And so Tsongkhapa decided to test it by asking some questions and see, can he answer the questions well? Then we can tell if it's really the enlightened being Manjushri. And he was very impressed. He asked him some of his major doubts about the nature of emptiness. And then the Manjushri told him that you don't really understand. He has to, is my understanding on par with that of these great Indian masters? He said, not with any of them. But he said, if you do retreat, he told them to go into seclusion and meditate. So Tsongkhapa did that for 5 years before having an experience of emptiness. And then he cultivated that experience for 12 more years before writing most of his major works. So he was in isolation, not complete isolation. He was still teaching occasionally and had some students with him, but it was more meditatively focused for about 16 years or so. But when he came back and taught, he still was very much emphasizing the importance of this conceptual approach. And actually, what the advice Manjushri gave to him, which I'll talk about on the last day, but one of the main things he said was, what you need to do is study in depth about the words of the Indian scholars and understand what they were really saying. The point is, they were trying to communicate something. All we have now is the words, but we have to understand what they were saying. So we have the words and we can just read the word. That's not enough, of course. We have to understand the deeper meaning. And it said when Tsongkhapa had his enlightened experience, he had a dream the night before of some of the Indian scholars, and one of them, Buddhapalita, came to him and touched the text to his head. And when he woke up, he read a passage from Buddhapalita's text, which he'd read many times, but suddenly it dawned on him what it was talking about. And that's when he experienced emptiness. So it came with some conceptual engagement, but then it went beyond that. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide here. Okay, so this is Lamrim. This is what we're going to talk about today. See, it's a little dark here, but you see this path here. This is the stages on a path. So Lamrim was a tradition within Tibet, and it's also the name of some of Tsongkhapa's major texts. So the word Lamrim means stages of the path. Lam means path, Rim means stage. So it's a way of approaching the teachings in a graded way, rather than, for example, if we read the teachings of the Buddha, if we read the sutras, some of them are very inspiring, but they're not in any particular order. They're tailored to particular questions that were asked to the Buddha at various times. So the Lamrim is a way of codifying this in a set order. And I'll say, honestly, for me early on, this was also challenging. And it might sound for some of you, because it felt very much, this is not the order I'm going in. It's not what's happening in my mind. But I've come to appreciate it over the years because it helps us conceptually to put it all together. It may not be that our minds work in this particular order. But if we keep cultivating this again and again, it's like I talked about earlier. We have our more coarse levels of mind, conceptual levels of mind, and the subtler levels. In our conceptual level, we work with this. It's very helpful to keep us balanced. But then how that unfolds in a subtler level might not be exactly in this order, and that's okay. But we know what we're trying to cultivate, and we know how to recognize when there is and is not some kind of development, right? So if we might think of ourselves as enlightened. This is a common trap in Buddhist history, and it seems to be a common trap today too. We can judge very clearly if we look at what is supposed to happen. We read about, well, if we have a real experience of renunciation, what's supposed to happen in the mind? What signs might be there? If we have a real experience of bodhicitta, what signs might be there? And we can judge against our own experience. We have to be quite honest with ourselves. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide again here, please. Okay, so here's the roots. I'm going to give again a little bit of historical background so we know where this came from. So first of all, I mentioned, I didn't put this in the slide here, but so the Buddha gave many different teachings within his lifetime. As soon as the Buddha passed away, his students began this process of trying to codify them and put them into a cohesive framework. And this gradually developed. So there were many different stages of this within Indian history. I don't have to go through all of them. But we're talking also here about Mahayana Buddhism. I may have mentioned before a little bit about that distinction, which I don't have time to talk about here. But within Mahayana Buddhism, the primary sutra, it's good to know this, are what is called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. There are many Mahayana sutras, but the most important one, at least according to our understanding within the Geluk school, the Tsongkhapa school, is the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, of which many of you might know the Heart Sutra, which is the most condensed, one of the most condensed of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. Most of them are much longer. The longest one is 13 volumes. And then the most commonly used one is the 25,000 verse, which is about 3 volumes. One volume is about 1,000 pages. This is a very long text. So likewise in these texts, the Buddha is just talking about emptiness. There is very little structure, and it's hard to understand how do you practice this. So in the 5th century, this Indian master Asanga wanted to understand how do we actually bring this into practice? How do we make this a practical application for ordinary people to go from starting point up to enlightenment? So he meditated at Gurapada cave near Bodh Gaya. You'll see this picture here. That's Gurapada cave. You can go there today and climb up to the top and see the cave where he was meditating, with the hope to meet the Buddha Maitreya, the future Buddha, who could teach him about how to use the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras as a graded path. So the story, anyway, take it for what you will, is that Asanga, after 12 years of ardent practice, finally met Maitreya. There's a whole background of that story. I don't have to go into the details. Who said, I will teach you. And he grabbed onto Maitreya's robe and they ascended into the Tushita heaven, where Maitreya had taught him these 5 texts. One of them is the Ornament for Clear Realization, which was one of the major texts that we study in the monastery today. And it's understood in the tradition that it was composed by Maitreya. The other 4 texts are also very important. They're not the ones that we study as central texts, but we read them a lot. They're quite inspiring texts. And I know Asanga's text. I've read many of Asanga's texts, and they're completely different. It certainly does feel like a different author, for what it's worth. But of course, with anything, without we recognize what we don't know, and don't make assumptions. So I don't know. It's also interesting, just a little twist in the story, with our talk about special relativity today. Who knows that this has any bearing? It's again quite far-fetched, perhaps, but it says that when Asanga returned from Tushita heaven, he had been gone for a few hours, but 50 years had passed on Earth. So for what it's worth. But then he brought these texts back, and within the Ornament for Clear Realization, then the 6th chapter of the text teaches serial realization, which means thinking about contemplating the stages of the teachings in a serial way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 173 in that chapter. This is understood to be the root of this way of thinking about the teachings of the Buddha in a stepwise manner. So later in the 11th century, the Indian master Atisha traveled to Tibet and observed that Tibetans had numerous misconceptions about how to integrate the various teachings they inherited from India. It was a mess, is what they say. Tibet had influx of teachings from India in the 8th, 9th century. Then the empire had collapsed. Tibet had fallen into a dark age. There was chaos and anarchy throughout the country. And there were all these different pockets of Buddhist practice that had different ideas, and nobody really knew how it all fit together. So in response to this, when Atisha came in the 11th century, he composed this text, Lamp for the Path, which is only 12 pages. A short text to clarify how to integrate these practices in a structured way so they wouldn't contradict each other. So it just talks about, first you have this, then you have this. So he, rather than saying this school is right, this school is wrong, he put them all together, that, well, this school has a piece of it, this school has a piece of it. Here's how it all fits together. To me, it's an interesting analogy to how Buddhism is understood now in a lot of modern Western countries, where there are a lot of teachings from many different traditions. And it's hard to know how it all fits together. So maybe somebody nowadays needs to compose such a text that's in tune with the modern times. But it's a very good precedent that was set at that time, how to integrate all of this without necessarily rejecting one or other, see all the value in all of them, and put it together in a way that this is how one person goes from a beginner stage to enlightenment. So let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so this was the development of Lamrim. How did it go after Atisha had come to Tibet? So Atisha's students developed 3 lineages: the instruction, the Lamrim, and the textual lineage, which just means that some of his students focused on different aspects of his teaching and transmitted that to their students, and they became separate. They interacted, but they had 3 separate lineages that were, a lot of it had to do with geography, where they were practicing. In the generation after Atisha, then the Tibetan Moklod and Shedup composed the stages of the teaching, which is the precursor to the Lamrim by Tsongkhapa, and expanding on Atisha's short text and relating it to textual sources. So he put a lot more detail. Atisha's text was only 12 pages, but he put, okay, here's this particular practice. Now here's a lot more detail on how do you do that, and giving a lot of quotations from the Buddha's teachings about what the Buddha taught, but putting them within that framework. And his student Drolungpa composed the great sages of the teachings, which is expanding it even more. So that was still available. So you see, Tsongkhapa in the 14th century was impressed by Drolungpa's work. He encountered this and received the transmission of all 3 lineages. You see these 3 lineages from Atisha. Tsongkhapa went to different places in Tibet to receive these lineages and understand how they practiced. And then we see at Retring Monastery in the picture here, which was the main monastery of Atisha's students. It says that Tsongkhapa had a vision of Atisha and the lineage masters tracing down from Atisha to his time, compelling him to compose a new synthesis. So that's when he composed a great treatise on the stages of the path, which is Lamrim Chenmo, which is available in English today. This text Tsongkhapa composed when he was 44 years old. So I mentioned that he was still very much in retreat at this time. But this is considered his first major text as a mature practitioner. His earlier text had been before he had some kind of experience of enlightenment. And this is still used today as one of the greatest texts in Tibetan literature about how to integrate all of the stages of the path. So let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so what themes are found in these stages? So I mentioned this point before, that the Buddha's teachings, the sutras, are a series of responses to concerns of students at varying capacities with diverse questions. The Lamrim literature organizes these teachings in a stepwise order, explaining how each instruction is related to various stages of spiritual development. This tradition accepts all 3 strands of practice. So we talk about Sharvakayana, and sometimes it's called Hinayana, which is how it's talked about in Tibet, but we try not to use that word today because it is a bit derogatory. It literally means small vehicle. Because there are people in the world now, especially in Theravada countries in Southeast Asia, who practice that as their main practice. But it's maybe a better way to talk about it is foundational vehicle, that in this tradition is not understood as something to be discarded. It's small, it's inferior. This is the foundation. Without this, nothing else can develop. And then we have Mahayana, the greater vehicle, which is the practices the Bodhisattva. And finally, Vajrayana, which is sometimes called Tantra, which is the most advanced practices, which is understood as an enhancement of this. It's not understood as something contradictory, which at the time of Atisha, that was one of the main things that he encountered in Tibet. They're the ones who practice Tantra and the ones who practice Sutra, the opposite of Tantra, and they each thought the other was wrong. Atisha said that actually, this should just be understood as the most developed part of the practice. I'll talk about that on the last day. Some of you may have heard of the teacher Chogyam Trungpa, who's quite controversial today. So I won't go into all the details about his life. But nevertheless, some of his teachings are exceptional, and people still find a lot of interesting things in the way he presented it. So he talked about Hinayana, he said, was like having legs, having a foundation with which you walk. You can't do anything without your legs. Mahayana is about developing your heart, developing compassion. But eventually you're ready to have a brain. And that's Vajrayana, that you're ready to be a genius. There's a possibility you could be a spiritual genius. But to get to that point, you have to have a lot of foundation. Otherwise, as we might see in the world, some people who are geniuses are also mentally unstable because they don't have any kind of foundation for how to manage this very powerful mind that they have. So we have to build in stages to get there. So he said this is integral to forming a complete path to enlightenment. Let's go on to the next slide. So we have analytical and placement meditation. This, some of you might know Mingyur Rinpoche, who's extraordinary. He's one of the great meditation masters today. If anyone is interested in learning about him, there's his book, In Love with the World, which is about his retreat that he did for some years. And then also there's a book called Altered Traits. I may have mentioned before. I don't think I did mention it though, which is a book by two modern psychologists, Daniel Goleman and Richard Davidson, which talks about their study of his brain, which is quite extraordinary. For people who are scientifically minded, this might be a helpful way to gain some conviction that something real is happening with these great meditators. So here we have analytical and placement meditation. So this is the broad strokes of understanding two kinds of meditation, as Tsongkhapa talked about it. So placement meditation involves focusing the mind on a single object. Right? So here we really don't want to have a lot of extraneous thoughts. The primary goal is to enhance single-pointed concentration. So for example, when we start this session with meditating on the breath, that is placement meditation, with the breath as an object. And I mentioned earlier the possibility of having the object of a visualized Buddha. That is also placement meditation. Again, it doesn't mean no thoughts at all. Actually, when we do placement meditation, we need to start with some thoughts. And if we have a lot of extraneous thoughts, sometimes we need to use thinking to overcome them. If it becomes too much, that we're too distracted, we start thinking, for example, if we're distracted by something that makes us very excited, we start thinking about the disadvantages of that object, that we gain detachment from it. But the goal is to have a very focused thought on one object. Whereas analytical meditation uses the foundation of concentration to contemplate important themes from the Buddhist teachings and relate them to one's personal experience. So here, within that space, that's the important point, foundation of concentration. We create space in our minds. Also, we created space in the first couple of sessions in our house. You build a meditation room and make it conducive space. Now you're creating space in your mind such that you can work with this without all kinds of other things going on. We might think of it like you go into a therapist session, right? You wouldn't want to have a therapist session in a crowded street. You go into a safe space where these things can come out, but not in an uncontrolled way. So then you start working with your mind, and you use particular contemplations to help you. But of course, how it goes is very much dependent on you. You don't have to think that just because it says this stage and this stage in the text, that it has to happen exactly like that, and any other kind of thought is extraneous. You don't want to get too far off. That's what we have mindfulness. Remember what we're trying to cultivate, but you might remember I had this experience and this is what I was thinking. And it's not exactly what it says in the text, but that's fine. You have to use your own wisdom to be able to analyze things. We say analysis. It means using your logic, using your reasoning powers, not just following by rote what is said in the text. The texts are meant to guide us. And then we see here, analytical meditation differs from mere distraction because A, one focuses on a chosen theme, B, it is supported by a base of concentration, and C, one brings wisdom to bear on the processes of mind rather than just following them reflexively. We don't just let our mind go. There's a poem by the 7th Dalai Lama called the four mindfulnesses. And it's just a few verses, but he ends every verse with a refrain. I will not just let my mind go. In the word gyayan in Tibetan, it's like the word they use for an elephant that's just gone wild. But I will keep it in the space of this chosen space. So he says, I will keep my mind within the first verses in the space of conviction in the teaching and in my teacher, and then in the space of compassion, and then in the space of clear appearance when we're meditating, and then in the space of emptiness. So we're recollecting what we're trying to cultivate. So we don't just let it go completely. That's a common example in the Indian text also. You might see that the wild elephant of the mind is restrained by the ropes of mindfulness that bring it back to the object of concentration. So let's, can we move on to the next slide again? Thank you. Okay, so I showed this picture before. This is my teacher. This is actually, I mentioned this is a book that I had the good fortune to be able to translate. So I have this here because we're talking about calm abiding and special insight, which is exactly what this book is about. So these are just the most enhanced forms of this same thing. Of placement meditation eventually can become calm abiding. And analytical meditation can lead to special insight. So these are not easy states to cultivate, right? So the word special insight in Sanskrit, vipassana, which in Pali is vipassana, so many people will know that term. In their tradition, and it's a valid tradition, I'm not criticizing their tradition by any means. Goenka, who found this vipassana tradition, had a very authentic teachers in Burma. But I'm just pointing out that in our tradition, they mean something a little different. So in our tradition, special insight vipassana is not something ordinary people experience. It's a very advanced state. So we'll look at this, what is it that we're trying to get? So we have some idea. So calm abiding is the culmination of placement meditation. Here, a meditator can focus comfortably on a chosen object for hours at a time without distraction, right? It's said to be a pliancy of body and mind, that the person can sit comfortably. Both their body and their mind do not create any obstacles for them. This can happen. It's not very common. And it's not like you meet a Tibetan monk and you assume they have calm abiding. It's actually quite rare. But it is inspiring to know that it happens in some cases. And Tibetan monks are very hesitant to talk about it. Although I did hear one story recently, it's nice to think about, but we always try to check. We never know. And I didn't know this monk very well, but there was one monk at our monastery who was 4 classes above me. And when he finished the study program, rather than going on to do the advanced Larampa degree, which I'm planning to start next year, he left and did meditation, which some monks do. It's not that common that they leave if they're that serious, because he was one of the best students in his class. Usually they would finish, but some do. Some do leave and meditate. And I was told by somebody that he wouldn't just brag about this, but he had told some of his friends, and the rumor had gotten around that he had said he'd come abiding, which is quite extraordinary. He said he could sit for 6 hours at a time without distraction, right? That's not considered enlightenment, but it's certainly an important step. As one of my teachers said, a Western teacher, a monk at our monastery, he said, if you don't have calm abiding, you're not even in the ballpark. Right? There's no possibility of getting enlightenment without that basis. Now, it doesn't mean we can't have anything. So Kappa talks about that actually in the Lamrim at the beginning of the section of calm abiding. He said, don't think that you can't have any cultivation. You can't have any change in your mind without calm abiding. That's a big mistake. But at the same time, if we're really talking about enlightenment, right? I was talking about this recently with an aspirant to our monastery, right? There's a difference between ordinary meditation and this kind of meditation, just like ordinary people exercise, using that example again, and being an Olympic athlete, right? If you really want to be an Olympic athlete, you're going to know that it's not easy. The things that they can do requires a lot of practice and a lot of cultivation of the body and the mind. And here it's the same. We're mainly focusing on the mind, but it also is a bodily process. We have to be able to sit comfortably and not get distracted by all the little sensations in our body. It takes a lot of practice and is something accessible, but many years and really strong dedication. So then we see special insight as the culmination of analytical meditation. So here, a meditator within the space of come abiding. So we cannot have special insight without come abiding. In this tradition, vipassana is not something that you can have by definition without come abiding. But within that space, rather than just staying on that focused space for 6 hours, you can analyze a chosen object without the analysis disturbing the concentration. That's the main point. If it disturbs the concentration, it's not yet special insight. And when somebody first has come abiding, that's what will happen. They try to think about something, but then they lose that focus. But when it gets to the point, to the contrary, that it's the analysis enhances concentration, that your analysis actually makes your mind more focused. That is special insight. And again, that's a necessary prerequisite for any kind of higher realization, because just having come abiding, if thinking about something disturbs it, then we can't really bring it outside of that space. We have to be able to experience that without just focusing on one thing. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so here's how in our tradition, this process is understood. Where do we begin? There's a 3-step process: hearing, learning, or study. That's all one step. It's just different ways of translating the same word, followed by contemplation, and followed by meditation. So these are all kinds of meditation in a broad sense, but the third one, meditation, is the very strict way, like actually achieving calm abiding and special insight. So this tradition, I said our tradition, it's very much emphasized within our school, the Gelug school, but it's definitely within the Indian tradition, especially the texts of Kamalashila, was an Indian scholar. If you remember my story earlier about Hashang, the Chinese monk, in the 8th century, the king of Tibet organized a public debate between Kamalashila and Hashang, who were both teaching in Tibet, because they had very contrary teachings, and he wanted to know who was right. And the king decided Kamalashila won the debate, so he asked Hashang to politely, please go back to China. And he said, Kamalashila is our teacher. So that became the major strand of Buddhism in Tibet, which used this style of meditation. Rather than simply seeing thought as an obstacle, it saw this as the foundation. So at this initial stage, the practice involves examining the teachings to gain a clear as possible understanding of what they're actually saying. So here we don't necessarily accept or reject it yet. Of course, we question it and we check, but we want to understand what they're saying before we go and decide whether it's right or not. Otherwise, it'll be a little bit premature to make a decision. This stage involves listening to teachings, reading books, and asking teachers for clarification. So it's not just reading a book, that's part of it, but also there's a discussion process going on. One dispels misunderstandings of what the teachings are saying. Ideally, a practitioner can suspend judgment about the veracity of teachings in order to first determine the precise meaning. But you'll see, nevertheless, a significant degree of confidence is necessary to be willing to take the time to engage in such learning. Right, so I said we suspend judgment, but you have to have some sense this is something worthwhile. They talk about that a lot in our tradition. That's actually something we debate about the first few years, because you have to have an impetus if you're going to spend years and years studying, which sometimes this can take if you really do it in a serious way. You have to think there is some reason that I'm inclined to think this is worth doing. So you don't just not think at all at this point. It's just that your main emphasis at the beginning stages is on learning. So let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so next we have contemplation and reflection. And as you'll see in our tradition, this is very much debate. This is actually a nunnery you'll see in India. They have some places where their nuns are able to debate as well, which is wonderful, because historically in Tibet, there was not as much access to this, but it's certainly become more available today for women and also for people of other cultures like us. So you see, next, a practitioner analyzes what he or she has learned, checking it against direct perception and reasoning, and scrutinizing it for internal contradiction. So here we really bring a skeptical mind to bear on the teachings. We have to be willing to question it and not feel that it's heretical somehow to question it. You'll see in debate, there's a very strong emphasis on asking any question and being willing to challenge anything. This stage can involve debate, discussion with peers, and personal practices of reading and meditating. So it's also some reading involved too, but the approach is slightly different. Now we're really trying to question it. The goal here is to gain conviction in the veracity of what has been learned, or to discard elements that are determined after careful examination to be interpretable. So if we find that something the Buddha said, we really analyze and see this is not right. That we do that in our tradition. We don't reject what the Buddha said. We say that, look at who he was talking to. Why was he saying this in this context? Right? The Buddha said many things. It said that in one context, the Buddha actually said to somebody, you should kill your mother and father. Right? That's not something we take literally. To know the context of that, there was a king who had done that. He had killed his father. And that king was in great regret of what he had done. And so when that king was walking by the teaching, and then Buddha knew he could hear him, he said, that's good, you should kill your father. That said that because he said that, it opened the king to the possibility of listening. Otherwise, he was in such a profound state of regret of what he had done that he wouldn't have been able to hear, to say, oh, it was a bad thing to do. But then he was inquiring, and then the Buddha explained, yes, your father is karma. Your father is what created your experience. And that's what you need to get rid of if you want to not experience this anymore. Right? So then the king was open to what he was saying. The Buddha was very skillful in bringing people in and helping them to come from where they were. So we look at that in different contexts. That's an extreme example, but there are many other examples. And in our tradition, a big part of our debate is to determine when can we really take this as intended for us now as practitioners, and when can we look at it as this was based on the cultural context of the time. We have to know, we don't have to copy everything that was done in any particular culture. Now we had study and hearing, and then we have contemplation. It's also good to see that these aren't strictly divided. It's not like you spend 10 years studying, then you spend 10 years contemplating. Our monastery is called a monastery, a Sarajay is called a monastery for hearing and contemplation. So the main focus is on those two, which is also, as I said, a kind of meditation. We are also trying to apply this to our minds. But then we have the next stage of meditation, so we'll go on to the next slide here, which is meditation in a very strict sense. So this is meditation or absorption. So now a practitioner develops single-pointed concentration, the calm abiding that I talked about earlier. Within the state of enhanced consciousness, he or she gains insight into the topics in a way that goes beyond words and ideas. Nevertheless, the words continue to be a guiding principle until the very late stages. So it's not that they start meditating and they discard the words, but they eventually have an understanding of it that goes beyond that. They think about the words they heard once, that they debated all those years. You see this monk, he's a Gache, meaning he's already finished the study program. And now he has time to really think about it because it's been so integrated into his way of thinking. Now to actually think, does this make sense? And how can I transform myself with this? So the examples that are given in the traditional text is someone who can practice swimming can discard the life vest. So that the study was the life vest, and eventually they're able to swim without that. Or somebody who rows to the shore of a vast lake and can leave the raft at the shore. The raft is compared to the teachings that they received. Now they finally reached that shore. That's not necessary. They don't have to keep carrying it on their back. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So how to structure a practice session? What do we do now that we have this idea? Well, I've talked about two different main things now in these 4 sessions. One is how to have preliminaries to a practice session. Now I've talked in a theoretical sense about how we meditate, but then how do we bring these together? So here's just an example. You also can tailor this a bit to what works for you. So you could start with the first 2 preparatory practices, cleaning the place and arranging offerings. Make 3 prostrations or more. You might like to make 100 prostrations in the morning. It's good exercise too. And then on a comfortable seat, begin the 3rd preparatory practice of setting the posture and begin with a breath meditation. So now set one's motivation, visualize the objects of refuge, and here you can begin an arranged practice text like the daily meditation on Shakyamuni Buddha that we did last week. And then visualize the merit field, which is the 4th practice, then offer the 7th prayer, and make supplication, all within that practice text. Now, if you have more time, you can do a practice of mantra recitation. So in that text, you'll see there's the mantra Shakyamuni Buddha, Om Muni Muni Mahamune Soha, or another merit-making practice, whatever is helpful for you. You might focus on one that you find useful. And then you can recite a Lamrim prayer, like the foundation of all good qualities, which is in that text, which is just reviewing the stages of the meditation. Next, we can go on to the next slide. So now we have the heart of the practice session. We're actually doing meditation on our analytical meditation. So now that the mind has been brought into a conducive state, begin a concentration meditation, like following the breath or visualizing an image of the Buddha. After some time, begin analytical meditation on a chosen topic. You can slowly read through a book and pause at appropriate times, or recall the points from memory. That's actually considered better if it's possible, if you have a good memory, because your mind will stay within that meditation. You don't have to engage your eye consciousness by looking at a book, but if you need to, that's perfectly fine. Take as much time as you need at each point, as long as you do not become distracted. That's the main point. So take 20 minutes if you want to one point, as long as you're really keeping with it and your mind doesn't just become distracted or bored. It's good to move on if you're finding yourself tired, so that you don't then become agitated and think, I don't want to meditate again. At the same time, take an active interest in what story and drama your mind is creating. So you're doing two things here. You have to keep an awareness of what you're trying to contemplate and also what's happening in your mind. They say it's like having a spy that's sort of in the background and seeing without trying to manipulate it per se. Sometimes it's useful to see. If you're spying, you don't want them to know you're there, so that you can actually see what they do when they don't think you're looking, right? Tonight, similar thing here with your own mind. This is your best opportunity to observe this process unfolding. If you are able to generate the relevant frame of mind, such as renunciation or whatever subject you're using, try to maintain focus on that mental state as long as you can. So try to enhance that and try to maintain that rather than it having just be a fleeting experience. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so that's the end of this talk. So that's good timing. We have about 10 minutes left. So I have discussion topics as often we do, but let's do a brief meditation here, and then we can load that up again, but leave the slides off now. So we'll just bring back the mind to meditation. We don't have a lot of time, but we can just try doing this, one of these topics. So we can think about what's considered one of the most fundamental topics is the contemplation on death. Hope this isn't uncomfortable for people. We'll talk about it again next week, but here, just think about, we can think about dying. And there's three steps in this analytical meditation. One is thinking about that death is definite. It's certain that I'm going to die. Thinking secondly, that the time of that is indefinite. I don't know when that's going to happen. I can't predict the day that I'm going to die, like I can have my birthday. And third, that when I die, the only thing that's going to matter is what I've cultivated in my mind. We can actually question, is that true? Maybe it is true that whatever pleasure I have in my life, however many possessions I have, that will matter. But we have to see, is that going to make a difference? We try to imagine that. So we'll go through those one at a time in just a few minutes. I can just give a guidepost when we move on to the next one, but just try it, see how it feels. This is really just an experiment. You might want to take a lot more time, either later today or another time, to try this. Okay, so let's begin. We'll take about a minute to just focus the mind. You can focus on your breath again. Okay, so now let's think about this topic, the first one. That death is certain. And is there anybody who doesn't die? Is there anything that can be done to prevent death? We might be able to prolong life, but can we prevent death altogether? Think about what that means and reflect on that and relate it to whatever occurs in your consciousness when you have that thought. So now we go on to the next, thinking about it's uncertain when that will happen. There are many ways to think about that there are all kinds of ways that the life can end. And we don't know when one of them is going to happen. Sometimes it's sudden, sometimes it's a prolonged process. Sometimes someone else who is in the process of dying, suddenly somebody who seems healthy dies before that person. It's never certain. So to think about that we never know how much time we have left. And then finally, let's just take a couple minutes to think about, in some sense, leave it open-ended. Think about what's going to matter to me most at that time. Try to be honest as if we can. Think about things that are really important to us now, maybe our career, our family, some particular hobby that we have. Is that going to be important to me? Or is there something else that's going to be important to me? What's really going to matter to me most when that time comes? Okay, so we'll pause here. I apologize. It's quite abbreviated. You might want to take much more time to do that kind of practice, but within the class session, it's obviously a little more difficult than you can do in your own when you have time. So let's, if you don't mind, Zella, just please load up the screen again so we can look at the last page. Yep. So there's some discussion topics to think about for yourself, or if you have somebody to discuss them with there. So what do you think are some of the major misconceptions about meditation today? You could do what I did and just search on the internet. And what is meditation? See what they say and think about it. What might make sense about that or not? Or look about the word they're using. What are they? Sometimes they might even seem to contradict themselves. That's how we often approach it in debate. And then what is the difference between analytical meditation and mere intellectual speculation? So I mentioned that a bit in the talk, but also think about it for yourself. And then, is the triad of hearing, contemplation, and meditation meaningful to you? How might you integrate these stages into your life? And then finally, we did last week the Shakyamuni Buddha meditation, so you can repeat that from last week, but add an analytical component as we talked about today. So at that point where it talks about the mantra recitation, and before you come back to the session and make the dedications, spend some time trying to do an analytical meditation. So if you're interested, of course, I mentioned about the Lamrim, and of course you can read the Lamrim. I didn't even put that in the list here because I'm sure that it's self-evident, but at the same time, just to mention, if you want to read about the Lamrim, there are many different ways to approach it. And I think it's in next week, I put it in the suggested reading, but of course there's the Great Stages of the Path by Tsongkhapa. It's published by Snow Lion and translated, but it might be hard to read because it's a translation of a Tibetan text and it's not written for a modern audience. The style of writing might not be immediately accessible. So it might be more helpful for some people. Some people find Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand by Pabongko Rinpoche helpful. Personally, what I found the most helpful in English was Geshe Sopa, the book by Geshe Sopa, Steps on the Path to Enlightenment. It's actually a 5-volume series. You have to be very patient, but if you have many years to slowly go through that text, Geshe Sopa, I really admired. I was fortunate to have some teachings from him. He lived in Wisconsin for about 50 years. He taught at the University of Wisconsin after he came out of Tibet. So that one I found very accessible, and I think people might find it hopefully that way. But it's all a commentary on the Lamrim. So, but the ones I've recommended here are just generally about trying to understand the tradition and how it approaches analytical meditation. So one is this book by Anne Klein, Knowledge and Liberation. It talks about how within this tradition, the knowledge and wisdom is understood as integral to the path to liberation. And then also, if you'd like to learn about Tsongkhapa, as I said, it's very helpful to know about the background and what context he was teaching in. So this book is exceptional by Thupten Jinpa, Tsongkhapa, a Buddha in the Land of Snows. It just came out a few years ago. Okay, so we can end the screen share. Okay, so thank you all. Glad you're still here. And if anyone has any questions before we complete the session, please, this is the time to ask. Okay. If there's no question this week, that's fine. We can finish on time then. So next week, I will give an overview of the Lamrim topics. So we'll start with just a general graph of what are the different topics within the Lamrim, and then I'll talk about them one at a time, just very briefly, so you have an idea of what all these different contemplations. And of course, you'll be learning about these if you manage to go through these different modules of the Discovering Buddhism. They should fill in the details, but here we'll just talk about what is the overall structure and how to integrate it in the way that we've talked about this week. So thank you again. Let's do a brief dedication. Della, is there something we can load up, or should I just make a dedication? Okay, we have something. Okay, so may whatever virtues I have collected benefit the teachings and all transmigratory beings, and in particular, may it cause the essence of perfect pure Lozendrapa's teachings to shine forever. May the precious supreme Bodhicitta not born arise and grow. May that arisen not decline, but increase more and more. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Oh. So actually, let's see, swift return. Because Lama Zopa, as some of you may have heard, the event, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has said that he has already been reborn. That we don't need to recite swift return. However, we have this here. So rather than asking him to come back to the world, very important to make prayers that there are no obstacles, because with young tulkus, we call them, young incarnate lamas, there are all kinds of obstacles that get in the way to developing in the way that we hope. So let's make prayers that this boy might, or girl, we don't know yet, could be, might develop in a way that is a benefit, that we can continue to have such benefit as we had with the last incarnation. Peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Saravakas and Pariteka Buddhas, victorious Lozang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all objects of refuge in infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Oh, okay, so this is the whole prayer. So holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through the explanation and practice, you were the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable venerable Guru, to you I make requests. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and from other living beings you suddenly departed to peace, what a great loss. Nevertheless, to the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of three jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta, of the children of the victorious ones, may this smile of reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. Okay, thank you very much. Hope to see you next week.